After 3 weeks of unanswered phone calls, I decided to quietly visit my daughter. But when I arrived, I noticed something moving under my grandson's bed. When the police lifted the bed, they found something that shocked the entire community. The truth left me pale. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Frank, and at 65 years old, I thought I knew my daughter well enough to sense when something was terribly wrong. But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered that Thursday afternoon when I decided to drive the 43 miles to Chloe's house unannounced. 3 weeks, that's how long it had been since Chloe last answered one of my calls. 3 weeks of going straight to voicemail, of text messages that went unanswered, of a growing knot in my stomach that told me something wasn't right. My daughter had always been independent, sometimes to a fault, but this silence felt different. It felt desperate. I'd raised Chloe on my own after her mother passed when she was 12. We'd been through everything together, her teenage rebellion, her first heartbreak, the struggles of single motherhood when Tommy came along 8 years ago. She'd never shut me out like this before. The drive to her neighborhood gave me time to think, time to worry. I kept telling myself that maybe she was just busy with work, or perhaps Tommy was going through a difficult phase at school. But deep down, I knew this wasn't about being busy. This was about fear. When I pulled into her driveway, the first thing I noticed was how overgrown the front yard had become. Chloe took pride in her small garden. She'd inherited that from her mother. Seeing the weeds choking her rose bushes sent another wave of concern through me. I knocked on the front door and waited. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. "Chloe, it's Dad. I know you're in there." Finally, I heard footsteps. The door opened just a crack, secured by the chain lock. Through the narrow gap, I could see part of Chloe's face. What I saw made my heart sink. She looked thin, thinner than I'd ever seen her. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and there was something in her expression I'd never seen before, a kind of hunted look like a deer caught in headlights. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you think I'm doing here? You haven't returned my calls in 3 weeks." I was worried sick. She glanced over her shoulder quickly, then back at me. "I'm sorry. I've just been really busy with work, and Tommy's been. He's been having some issues at school." "Then let me in. Let me help." Now's not a good time. I'd spent enough years reading people to know when someone was lying to me. My daughter was terrified, and she was lying badly. "Chloe, open this door right now." Something in my tone must have convinced her because she reluctantly unlatched the chain. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was seriously wrong. The house felt different. The warm, lived-in feeling that had always characterized Chloe's home was gone, replaced by an oppressive tension that seemed to hang in the air like fog. The living room was too clean, almost sterile, as if someone had scrubbed away all traces of normal family life. "Where's Tommy?" I asked. "In his room. He's not feeling well today." I studied my daughter's face. She couldn't meet my eyes, and her hands were trembling slightly. This wasn't the confident, capable woman I'd raised. This was someone who was scared out of her mind. "I want to see him." "Dad, please, he's sleeping," and I was already walking down the hallway toward Tommy's room. Behind me, I could hear Chloe's footsteps, quick and nervous. I knocked gently on Tommy's door. "Hey, buddy, it's Grandpa." "Come in," came a small voice from inside. When I opened the door, my heart broke a little. Tommy was sitting on his bed, still in his pajamas, even though it was past 3 in the afternoon. My grandson had always been a bright, talkative kid, the kind of 8-year-old who could chatter your ear off about dinosaurs or video games or whatever had captured his interest that week. But this wasn't that child. This Tommy looked smaller somehow, withdrawn. His eyes, which used to light up when he saw me, seemed dull and cautious. "Hey there, buddy," I said, settling onto the edge of his bed. "How are you feeling?" He shrugged. "Okay, I guess." That's when I noticed something odd. There was movement under his bed, a subtle shifting like something was alive down there. Tommy's eyes darted toward the floor, then quickly back to me. "Tommy, what's under your bed?" Before he could answer, Chloe appeared in the doorway. "Dad, we should let Tommy rest." But I was already kneeling down, trying to peer under the bed. Whatever was down there seemed to sense my presence because the movement became more pronounced. "Don't!" Chloe's voice was sharp. Panicked, she rushed forward and grabbed my arm. "Please, Dad, just leave it alone." I looked at her face and saw something that chilled me to the bone. She wasn't just scared, she was terrified. And that terror seemed to revolve around whatever Tommy was hiding under his bed. Tommy was watching this exchange with the kind of careful attention that children develop when they're living in an unstable environment. He was reading the adults in the room, trying to gauge danger levels, trying to figure out what was safe to say or do. "Honey," I said gently to Chloe, What's going on here? And don't tell me nothing because I can see that something is very wrong. She looked at Tommy, then at me, and I could see her internal struggle playing out across her face. Part of her wanted to tell me everything, but something was holding her back. Something that had her paralyzed with fear. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the soft sounds coming from under Tommy's bed. Whatever was down there was definitely alive, and from Tommy's protective stance, it was something he cared about deeply. I reached out and took Chloe's hand. It was ice cold despite the warm afternoon. Whatever it is, I told her quietly, we can fix it, but I can't help if I don't know what's happening. She squeezed my hand so tightly it hurt, and when she looked at me, I saw tears threatening to spill over. You don't understand, Dad. Some things can't be fixed. Some things just have to be endured. The resignation in her voice scared me more than anything else. This wasn't my daughter talking. This was someone who had given up hope. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of Tommy's frightened eyes, or the way Chloe had practically begged me to leave whatever was under that bed alone. I'd spent a sleepless night trying to make sense of what I'd witnessed, and by dawn I'd made a decision. I was going back. This time, I brought reinforcements. A box of Tommy's favorite chocolate chip cookies from the bakery downtown, and enough determination to get to the bottom of whatever was happening in my daughter's house. When Chloe answered the door, she looked even worse than the day before. Her hair was unwashed and she was wearing the same clothes from yesterday, but what struck me most was how she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if she expected someone to appear at any moment. Dad, you can't keep showing up like this. Yes, I can. I'm your father and I'm worried about you, about both of you. She let me in reluctantly, and I noticed she immediately locked the door behind me, not just the regular lock, but the deadbolt and the chain as well. When I raised an eyebrow at this, she just shrugged. You can never be too careful these days. Tommy was in the living room this time, sitting on the couch with a coloring book, but he wasn't coloring. He was just staring at the pages, his crayons untouched beside him. When he saw me, he managed a small smile. Hi, Grandpa. Hey there, buddy. I brought you something. I handed him the box of cookies, and for the first time in 2 days, I saw a genuine spark of interest in his eyes. Can I have one now? Of course you can. As Tommy munched on his cookie, I sat down next to him. So, tell me about school. How's third grade treating you? He shrugged. It's okay. I haven't been going much lately. I looked sharply at Chloe, who was hovering in the kitchen doorway. He's been sick, she said quickly. A lot of stomach bugs going around. But Tommy didn't look sick. He looked tired and anxious, but not sick. And something told me his absences from school had nothing to do with any virus. Tommy, I said carefully, remember how we used to have our special talks, just you and me? He nodded, his eyes brightening slightly. Well, I was thinking maybe we could have one of those talks today, maybe in your room. I saw Chloe tense up immediately. Dad, I don't think that's… Mom, Tommy interrupted, his voice stronger than I'd heard it in days. Can Grandpa see my room, please? There was something in the way he asked. Not just a child's request, but something more urgent, like he needed me to see whatever he was hiding. Chloe looked torn. Finally, she nodded. Just be careful, okay? Tommy led me down the hallway to his room, and I could feel Chloe following behind us, her anxiety practically radiating off her in waves. Once we were in Tommy's room, he closed the door and turned to me with an expression far too serious for an 8-year-old. Grandpa, can you keep a secret? Depends on the secret, buddy. If it's something that might hurt you or your mom, then I might have to tell someone. He considered this for a moment, then nodded as if my answer satisfied him. I've been writing letters. Letters? To who? To people at school, Mrs. Henderson, my teacher, and the guidance counselor, Mrs. Martinez, and sometimes to the police. My blood ran cold. Why are you writing to the police, Tommy? Instead of answering, he got down on his hands and knees and reached under his bed. When he emerged, he was holding a shoebox, and from the careful way he handled it, I could tell it contained something precious to him. I keep them all here, he said, sitting on his bed and opening the box. I write them, but I don't send most of them. I need to write them. Inside the box were dozens of pieces of paper, some torn from notebooks, others written on the back of school worksheets. They were covered in Tommy's careful third-grade handwriting, and as I picked up the first one, I felt my hands start to shake. Dear Mrs. Henderson, it read, I'm scared to come to school because Uncle Rick might be at my house when I get back. He makes Mom cry when she thinks I'm not listening. Can you help us? Love, Tommy. I looked at my grandson, this brave little boy who had been trying to navigate a situation no child should ever have to face. Who is Uncle Rick, Tommy? He's not really my uncle. He's Mom's friend, but he's not a nice friend. I picked up another letter, this one addressed to the police. Dear police officers, Uncle Rick says bad things about my mom and sometimes he grabs her arm really tight. She says everything is okay, but her face gets sad and scared. I don't know what to do. My heart was breaking with each letter I read. This child had been documenting a situation of fear and intimidation, trying desperately to find help for his mother and himself in the only way he knew how. Tommy, how long has Uncle Rick been coming to your house? A few months. Ever since we stopped visiting you and Grandma Sarah's grave. That timeline matched perfectly with when Chloe had started avoiding my calls. And your mom, is she scared of Uncle Rick too? Tommy nodded solemnly. She tries to hide it, but I can tell. She gets really quiet when he comes over, and after he leaves, she cries. She thinks I don't know, but I hear her. I picked up another letter, this one more recent. Dear God, Uncle Rick said he has pictures of Mom doing bad things, and if she doesn't do what he says, he'll show everyone and take me away from her. I don't understand what pictures, but Mom believes him. Please help us, I don't want to lose my mom. The room suddenly felt too small, too airless. This wasn't just about some boyfriend who was causing problems. This was blackmail. Someone was using threats and intimidation to control my daughter, and she'd been dealing with it alone, trying to protect Tommy while being trapped in an impossible situation. Tommy, these letters, they're very important. You've been very brave writing them, but I never sent them, he said, looking ashamed. I wanted to, but I was scared Uncle Rick would find out and hurt Mom worse. I pulled my grandson into a hug, feeling his small body trembling against mine. You did nothing wrong, buddy, nothing at all. From outside the room I could hear Chloe pacing in the hallway. She knew what I was discovering, and she was probably terrified about what would happen next. Tommy, I need you to do something very important for me. I need you to keep these letters safe, okay? Can you do that? He nodded eagerly. And I need you to trust me to help your mom. It might get a little scary for a while, but I promise you we're going to fix this. As I stood up to leave the room, Tommy grabbed my hand. Grandpa, Uncle Rick said that if Mom tells anyone about their arrangement, he'll make sure I never see her again. He said he has friends who can make that happen. The words hit me like a physical blow. No wonder Chloe had been so terrified, so desperate to keep me away. She wasn't just protecting herself. She was protecting her son from a man who was willing to use a child as leverage. When I walked out of Tommy's room, I found Chloe sitting on the hallway floor, her back against the wall, her knees pulled up to her chest. She looked up at me with eyes full of shame and terror, and I knew she understood that I'd seen the letters. Dad, I can explain. No, I said firmly, settling down on the floor beside her. You don't need to explain anything. You need to let me help you. She shook her head violently. You don't understand. If Rick finds out I told anyone, he'll follow through on his threats. He has connections, Dad. People who can make custody cases disappear, who can make me look unfit. He's shown me what he's capable of. The way she said his name, Rick, was like she was afraid the word itself might summon him. I'd never seen my daughter so broken, so convinced that she was trapped. Tell me about these pictures he claims to have. Chloe's face crumpled. There aren't any pictures, Dad. At least not the kind he threatens with. But he's very good at making lies sound convincing. He knows things about my past, about mistakes I made when I was younger, and he's twisted them into something that could sound terrible to a judge. What kind of mistakes? She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When Tommy was a baby, I went through a rough patch. His father had just left. I was working 2 jobs, barely sleeping. I made some poor choices about who I trusted to watch Tommy when I had to work nights. Nothing bad happened to him, but Rick found out about it somehow, and he's convinced me that he could use it to paint me as a negligent mother. My heart ached for her. Those early years after Tommy was born had been difficult. I remembered how hard she'd worked to provide for her son, how she'd sacrificed everything to be a good mother. The idea that someone could twist that struggle against her made me furious. How did he find out about any of this? He used to work for a private investigation company. He knows how to dig up information, how to find people's vulnerabilities. When we first started, when he first showed interest in me, I thought he was just being thorough about getting to know me. I even thought it was sweet that he wanted to understand my past. I felt sick. This man hadn't just stumbled into their lives. He'd targeted Chloe specifically, researched her weaknesses, and then exploited them. How did you meet him? At Tommy's school. There was a career day and Rick came to talk about investigation work. Afterward, he approached me and said he'd noticed Tommy seemed like a really bright kid. We started talking and he asked me out for coffee, I thought. She laughed bitterly. I thought I was lucky that someone interesting was paying attention to me. When did things change? About 6 weeks after we started dating, he came over for dinner, and while I was in the kitchen, he went through my mail. When I confronted him about it, he said he was just looking out for me, making sure I wasn't in any financial trouble. He'd found some old bills from when I was struggling, and he started asking questions about that difficult period with Tommy. The picture was becoming clearer and more disturbing. Rick had systematically gathered information about Chloe's vulnerabilities and then used that knowledge to establish control over her. At first, it felt like he was just being protective. He'd offer to help with things, give advice about Tommy's school, suggest ways to improve our situation. But gradually, the suggestions became demands. The help came with strings attached, and the questions about my past became more invasive. When did he first threaten you? Chloe's breathing became shallow. About 3 months ago, I'd started to feel uncomfortable with how controlling he was becoming, and I tried to break things off. That's when he told me about all the information he'd gathered. He laid it all out like a case file. Every mistake I'd ever made, every moment of struggle, all twisted to make me look like an unfit mother. But these weren't real threats, Chloe. Any judge would see through, would they? She looked at me with desperate eyes. I'm a single mother who's worked multiple jobs, who's made mistakes, who's struggled financially. Rick knows exactly how to present information to make it look damning, and he has friends in the legal system, Dad, people who owe him favors from his investigation days. I was beginning to understand the sophisticated nature of Rick's manipulation. This wasn't just emotional abuse, it was psychological warfare conducted by someone who knew exactly how the system worked and how to exploit it. He made me realize how precarious my situation really is. One phone call from him to Child Protective Services, one carefully worded complaint to the school about my parenting, and I could lose everything. Tommy could end up in foster care while I fight to prove my innocence. The fear in her voice was heartbreaking because it wasn't irrational. It was based on a very real understanding of how easily someone's life could be destroyed by false accusations. So I agreed to his terms. I stopped seeing friends, stopped talking to family, made myself completely dependent on his approval, because the alternative, losing Tommy, was unthinkable. What exactly are his terms? Chloe wrapped her arms tighter around herself. Complete availability. I have to be ready to see him whenever he wants. Cancel plans if he objects to them. Ask permission before making decisions about Tommy's care or education. And I have to pretend to be grateful for his protection and guidance. The level of control Rick had established was staggering. He'd effectively made Chloe a prisoner in her own life, using her love for Tommy as the key to her cage. He monitors everything. My phone calls, my purchases, who I talk to. He's installed security cameras around the house under the guise of keeping us safe, but I know they're really there so he can watch us when he's not here. That explained the sterile feeling I'd noticed in the house. It wasn't just clean. It was controlled, arranged to satisfy someone else's standards rather than reflecting the natural chaos of a family home. And Tommy knows something's wrong. Tommy sees everything, Chloe said sadly. He's 8 years old. But he's learned to read situations like a survival skill. He knows when Rick is coming over before I do sometimes, just from subtle changes in my behavior. He started writing those letters because he can see that I'm scared and he doesn't understand why I won't ask for help. The courage it had taken for Tommy to document their situation suddenly became even more remarkable. A child had recognized that the adults in his world were trapped in something dangerous, and he'd tried to create a record that might someday help them escape. Dad, Chloe said quietly, you have to promise me you won't do anything to provoke Rick. If he suspects that you know what's happening, he'll escalate. He's made it clear that he has ways to make my life much worse than it already is. But as I looked at my daughter, this strong, capable woman who'd been reduced to cowering in her own hallway, I knew I couldn't make that promise. Some situations couldn't be endured indefinitely. Some cages had to be opened regardless of how frightening the world outside might seem. Honey, I said gently, how often does Rick come by the house? She glanced at her phone nervously. He usually stops by on Thursdays around dinner time to check on us and make sure we're following his guidelines. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was Thursday, and it was almost 5 o'clock. At 5:30 exactly, we heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Chloe's transformation was immediate and terrifying to watch. The broken, frightened woman I'd been talking to disappeared, replaced by someone who was performing the role of a grateful, compliant girlfriend. Dad, please, she whispered urgently, let me handle this. Don't say anything that might make him suspicious. Through the window, I watched a man in his early 40s get out of a silver sedan. Rick was average height, unremarkable in most ways, except for his eyes. Even from a distance, I could see the calculating way he surveyed the house, the yard, the street, like someone conducting surveillance. When Chloe opened the door, her voice was artificially bright. "Rick, I wasn't expecting you today. Weren't you?" His tone was pleasant, but there was something underneath it that made my skin crawl. "I specifically told you I'd be stopping by Thursday evening to discuss Tommy's school situation." "Of course, I'm sorry. I've just been a bit scattered lately." Rick stepped into the house and immediately noticed me sitting on the couch. His expression didn't change, but I felt his attention sharpen like a predator spotting potential prey. "And who's this?" "This is my father, Frank. Dad, this is Rick, my friend." Rick extended his hand to me with a smile that never reached his eyes. His handshake was firm, lasting just a moment too long, a subtle assertion of dominance. "Frank, it's so good to finally meet you. Chloe's told me so much about you." I doubted that was true, considering Chloe had been avoiding all contact with me for months, but I played along. "All good things, I hope." "Oh, absolutely. She mentioned you're retired military." I hadn't told Chloe to share that information with him, which meant he'd either pressured her for details about me or had researched me independently. Either possibility was concerning. Army, 22 years. Impressive. I have a lot of respect for veterans. In my line of work, I've had the pleasure of working with many former military personnel. The way he emphasized my line of work felt deliberate, like he wanted me to ask about it. When I didn't take the bait, he continued anyway. "I run a private investigation and security consulting firm. Corporate work mostly, but sometimes domestic situations that require discretion." Tommy had wandered into the living room during this exchange, and I watched Rick's demeanor shift as he noticed the boy. His smile became warmer, more genuine looking, but there was something predatory about the way he studied my grandson. "Tommy, how's my favorite little man doing?" "Fine," Tommy replied quietly, staying close to his mother's side. "Just fine? Come on, you can do better than that. Tell Uncle Rick what you've been up to this week." The title, Uncle Rick, made my stomach turn, especially knowing what Tommy had written in his letters about this man. I watched my grandson struggle with the interaction, trying to be polite while clearly uncomfortable. "I've been coloring mostly, and reading." "Reading's good. Education is important." Rick glanced at Chloe. "Speaking of which, I noticed Tommy's been absent from school quite a bit lately. We should probably discuss that." The casual way he said "we" was chilling. This man had no legal relationship to Tommy, yet he was speaking as if he had parental authority. "He's been fighting a stomach bug," Chloe said quickly. "Has he seen a doctor about this ongoing illness?" The question was phrased with concern, but I could hear the challenge underneath it. Rick was testing Chloe, seeing if her story would hold up under scrutiny. "I've been monitoring it closely. If it continues, I'll make an appointment." "That's probably wise. We wouldn't want the school to start asking questions about excessive absences. There are protocols they have to follow when children miss too much class." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Rick was reminding Chloe that he had the power to make her parenting choices appear suspicious to the authorities. "Tommy," Rick said, turning back to my grandson, "why don't you go play in your room while the adults talk? We have some boring grown-up stuff to discuss." Tommy looked at his mother, who nodded reluctantly. As he headed toward his room, Rick called after him, "And Tommy, maybe put on some music or watch something on your tablet. Sometimes adult conversations can be confusing for little ears." Once Tommy was gone, Rick settled into a chair across from us, and I could feel the atmosphere in the room change. The performance of casual friendliness dropped away, replaced by something much more businesslike and intimidating. "Frank, I have to say, I'm surprised to see you here. Chloe mentioned that you two don't get together very often anymore. We're working on spending more time together." I said carefully, "That's wonderful. Family is so important." Rick turned to Chloe. "I hope this visit isn't interfering with any of our previous discussions about maintaining appropriate boundaries." Chloe's face went pale. "No, of course not. Dad just stopped by unexpectedly." "I see. Well, unexpected visits can sometimes be complicated, especially when there are ongoing situations that require careful management." I felt like I was listening to a foreign language where every word had a double meaning. Rick was communicating threats and instructions to Chloe in language that sounded perfectly reasonable to an outside observer. "Chloe's been telling me about some of the challenges she's been facing," I said, testing the waters. Rick's attention snapped to me with laser focus. "Challenges? Just the usual single-parent stuff. Balancing work and Tommy's needs, that sort of thing." Rick relaxed slightly. "Yes, single parenting can be overwhelming. That's actually part of why I've been trying to provide some stability and guidance. Chloe's been under a lot of stress lately, haven't you, sweetheart?" The endearment sounded obscene coming from his mouth, especially given what I knew about their relationship. I've been managing, Chloe said quietly. You've been doing more than managing. You've been making real progress on some of the areas we identified for improvement. Your household organization, your financial planning, your consistency with Tommy's routines. All much better than when we first started working together. Working together, as if this were some kind of professional relationship rather than systematic psychological abuse. It's amazing what a little structure and accountability can accomplish, Rick continued, speaking to me but clearly directing his words at Chloe. Some people just need guidance to reach their potential. I wanted to punch him. This smug predator was sitting in my daughter's living room, describing his manipulation and control as if he were doing her a favor. Of course, Rick added casually, change can be difficult. Sometimes people resist what's best for them, or they let outside influences interfere with their progress. Another threat delivered with a smile. I should probably get going, I said, standing up. I'd heard enough to understand the situation, and I didn't trust myself to sit there much longer without saying something that might make things worse for Chloe. So soon? Rick seemed genuinely pleased that I was leaving. As Chloe walked me to the door, Rick called out from the living room. Frank, it was great meeting you. I hope we'll see each other again soon. At the door, Chloe squeezed my hand desperately. Dad, please be careful, she whispered. He knows things about people. If he sees you as a threat. I squeezed back. I understand. But honey, this can't go on forever. It has to, she said, her eyes filling with tears. It has to. As I drove home, my hands shaking with rage and determination, I realized that Rick had made a crucial error. He'd revealed himself to me, shown me exactly what kind of man he was and how he operated. He thought he was dealing with another victim to intimidate or manipulate. But I wasn't a victim. I was a father whose family was being threatened, and I had skills Rick couldn't even imagine. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, drawing on 22 years of military training to develop a strategy. Rick might be good at intimidating vulnerable women and children, but he'd never dealt with someone who understood tactical planning and psychological warfare from the other side. The first thing I did was research. Rick had been careless enough to tell me the name of his business, and within an hour of internet searching, I had a clearer picture of who I was dealing with. His private investigation firm was legitimate, but barely. Most of his online reviews were either glowing testimonials that read like they'd been written by the same person, or scathing accounts from clients who felt they'd been overcharged and underserved. More troubling were the gaps in his professional history. Rick claimed to have 15 years of experience, but I could only verify about 8 years of actual business operation. The missing years coincided with a period when someone matching his description had been involved in several harassment complaints that were ultimately dropped, probably because the complainants had been intimidated into silence. By morning, I had a plan. But first, I needed to understand exactly what evidence Rick claimed to have against Chloe. I called her at 9 a.m., knowing Rick would likely be monitoring her phone calls. Dad, is everything okay? Her voice was strained. I was hoping we could have lunch today, just the two of us. There are some things I wanted to discuss about Tommy's summer plans. There was a long pause. I could almost hear her calculating whether this request would be acceptable to Rick. I think that would be okay. Where did you want to meet? That little diner on Maple Street, the one with the outdoor seating. I chose the location deliberately. Public enough to be safe, but with outdoor seating that would make electronic surveillance difficult. When Chloe arrived at noon, she looked like she hadn't slept either. She kept glancing around nervously, as if she expected Rick to materialize at any moment. Dad, we can't stay long. Rick expects me back by 1:30 for a conference call he's arranged with Tommy's teacher. A conference call about what? About Tommy's absences and his behavioral changes at home. Rick thinks the school needs to be aware of the situation so they can provide appropriate support. I felt sick. Rick was systematically building a case that Chloe was an unstable parent who couldn't manage her child's needs without his intervention. Honey, I need you to tell me exactly what Rick claims to have on you. Not the vague threats, the specific allegations. Chloe's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee. He has documentation of the period when Tommy was 18 months old and I was working nights at the restaurant. I sometimes had to leave Tommy with neighbors or less reliable babysitters when my regular childcare fell through. That's not criminal, Chloe. That's a mother doing whatever it took to provide for her child. But Rick has statements from some of those babysitters claiming I left Tommy in unsafe situations. He says one of them is willing to testify that I frequently left Tommy crying for hours, that I seemed overwhelmed and possibly under the influence when I picked him up. My jaw clenched. These babysitters, do you remember them saying anything like this at the time? No, they were all kind to me, understanding about how difficult things were, but Rick found them somehow. and he says people's memories can be influenced by the right questions and the right incentives. Rick had either coerced these women into making false statements or had fabricated the statements entirely. Either way, he constructed a narrative that could be devastating in a custody proceeding. What else? Financial records showing I was behind on rent and utilities during that period. Pictures of the apartment I was living in then. It was small and not in the best neighborhood. Medical records showing I sought treatment for exhaustion and depression. None of that proves you were an unfit mother. Individually, no. But Rick says that when you present it all together, along with character testimony from people who will say I seemed unstable during that period, it creates a compelling case that I've always struggled with parenting responsibilities. The sophistication of Rick's manipulation was breathtaking and terrifying. He'd taken the normal struggles of a young single mother and weaponized them into a narrative of incompetence and neglect. Chloe, has Rick ever physically hurt you or Tommy? No, never. He's too smart for that. Everything he does is psychological, emotional. He's never even raised his voice to me. He just applies pressure, makes it clear what the consequences will be if I don't comply with his expectations. What about the security cameras he installed? They're everywhere. Living room, kitchen, Tommy's room, my bedroom. He says they're for our protection, but I know he reviews the footage. He'll make comments about conversations I've had or things I've done when he wasn't there. The violation of privacy was staggering. But I knew Rick had probably positioned the surveillance as a reasonable security measure that a concerned boyfriend might suggest. Has he ever made recordings of your conversations? I don't know for sure, but I assume so. He seems to know about every phone call I make, every conversation I have with Tommy. Sometimes he'll reference things I never told him about. I pulled out a small device I'd purchased that morning, a basic signal detector that could identify hidden recording equipment. Chloe, I need you to keep this with you. If it beeps or lights up when you're talking to Rick, you'll know he's recording. She stared at the device like it was a snake. Dad, if he finds this, he'll know you're helping me plan something. Then don't let him find it. We sat in silence for a moment, both understanding that we were moving into dangerous territory. Rick had spent months establishing total control over Chloe's life, and any attempt to undermine that control would provoke retaliation. There's something else, Chloe said quietly. Rick has been talking about making our relationship more permanent. He suggested that Tommy would benefit from having a stable father figure, and that my financial situation would be much more secure if I had a husband. The implications hit me like a punch to the gut. Marriage would give Rick legal standing in Tommy's life and would make it even harder for Chloe to escape his control. How have you responded to these suggestions? I've been stalling, saying I want to take things slowly for Tommy's sake, but Rick is getting impatient. He's made it clear that he views our current arrangement as temporary. Either we move forward with his plans or he'll have to reconsider his investment in our relationship. Another threat wrapped in reasonable language. Rick was forcing Chloe to choose between accepting permanent imprisonment through marriage or facing the consequences of his fabricated evidence. Dad, I can see what you're thinking, but you have to understand. There's no way out of this that doesn't destroy Tommy's life. Even if we could prove Rick is lying, the process would put Tommy through hell. He'd be questioned by social workers, possibly removed from my care temporarily, subjected to psychological evaluations. And Rick has made it clear he has enough connections to make that process as traumatic as possible. I reached across the table and took her hand. Honey, what kind of life is Tommy going to have if this continues? You think Rick's control is going to get less intrusive over time? You think he's going to stop monitoring and manipulating once you're married to him? Tears started flowing down her cheeks. I know you're right, but I'm so scared. What if his threats aren't empty? What if he really can take Tommy away from me? Then we make sure that doesn't happen. But Chloe, you have to trust me on this. Sometimes the only way out of a trap is to spring it deliberately, on your own terms. As we prepared to leave, I handed her a prepaid cell phone. Keep this hidden. If you need to reach me without Rick knowing, use this number. And Chloe, start documenting everything. Every threat, every demand, every time he reviews those camera feeds. We're going to need evidence of our own. She slipped the phone into her purse like she was handling contraband, which in Rick's world she probably was. Dad, promise me that whatever you're planning, you won't do anything that puts Tommy at risk. I promise, but I also promise you this. Rick's reign of terror is about to end. As I watched her drive away, I felt the familiar calm that came with committing to a course of action. Rick thought he was the predator in this situation, but he'd made a critical error in judgment. He'd threatened my family. 6 months later, I was sitting in my backyard watching Tommy help me tend to the vegetable garden we'd planted together. The transformation in my grandson was remarkable. Gone was the quiet, fearful child I'd found hiding letters under his bed. Tommy laughed freely, asked endless questions, and had opinions about everything from which tomatoes were ready to harvest, to why we should add a bird feeder near the pepper plants. "Grandpa, look," Tommy called out, holding up a perfect red tomato. "This one's ready. Good eye, buddy, that'll taste great in tonight's salad." It had taken 3 carefully orchestrated weeks to free my family from Rick's control, and the key had been understanding that men like Rick were fundamentally cowards who relied on fear and intimidation because they couldn't handle direct confrontation. The first step had been gathering real evidence. Using contacts from my military days, I'd hired a legitimate private investigator, someone who specialized in exposing fraudulent investigators. Within a week, we'd uncovered Rick's pattern of targeting vulnerable women, his history of harassment complaints, and most importantly, evidence that several of his witness statements against Chloe had been fabricated. The second step had been more delicate. I'd needed to create a situation where Rick would reveal his true nature in front of witnesses who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. I'd arranged for Tommy to have a medical emergency, nothing dangerous, just a convincing case of food poisoning that required a trip to the emergency room. When Chloe called Rick to explain why she couldn't meet him as planned, his response had been recorded on the prepaid phone I'd given her. Instead of concern for Tommy's well-being, Rick had launched into a tirade about Chloe's irresponsible parenting and her pattern of putting her child at risk. Most damaging of all, he'd threatened to contact Child Protective Services immediately to report this latest incident as evidence of neglect. The recording captured Rick's complete lack of genuine concern for Tommy and his eagerness to use a child's illness as ammunition against Chloe. More importantly, it revealed his willingness to file false reports with government agencies. The third step had been the most satisfying. I'd invited Rick to meet me for coffee, ostensibly to discuss my concerns about Chloe's stability and to seek his advice about how I could help support his intervention in her life. Rick had arrived at that meeting confident that he was gaining another ally. Instead, he'd found himself across the table from a man who knew exactly who he was and what he'd been doing. "Rick," I'd said calmly, sliding a folder across the table, "I think we need to have an honest conversation." Inside the folder were copies of his fabricated witness statements, documentation of his harassment complaints, and transcripts of his threatening phone calls to Chloe. His face had gone white as he flipped through the pages. "I don't know what you think this proves," he'd said, but his voice had lost all its confidence. "It proves you're a fraud who preys on vulnerable women and children. It proves you've been systematically terrorizing my daughter with false evidence and manufactured threats. And most importantly, it proves that you've bitten off more than you can chew." Rick had tried to bluster, to turn the situation around, to regain control of the narrative. But when you strip away a predator's power to intimidate, there's usually nothing left but a pathetic, frightened man. "You have 24 hours to remove all surveillance equipment from my daughter's home, delete any recordings you've made, and disappear from their lives permanently," I told him. "If you contact Chloe, Tommy, or anyone in our family after that, copies of this evidence will be forwarded to the state licensing board, the district attorney's office, and every client you've ever had." "You can't prove any of this would hold up in court," Rick had said weakly. "Maybe not. But I don't need a court conviction to destroy your business and your reputation. All I need to do is make sure the right people know who you really are." The beauty of dealing with a manipulator like Rick was that his entire livelihood depended on maintaining a facade of respectability. Once that facade was stripped away, he had no power left. Rick had left that coffee shop a defeated man, and true to form, he'd disappeared from our lives completely, rather than face the consequences of his actions. The hardest part had been helping Chloe overcome the psychological damage Rick had inflicted. Months of constant surveillance and threats had left her jumping at shadows, second-guessing every parenting decision, and struggling to believe that she was truly free. But gradually, with the help of a therapist who specialized in psychological abuse cases, Chloe had begun to reclaim her life. She'd started socializing again, made new friends, even begun dating someone. A kind, patient man who understood that she needed to heal at her own pace. "Grandpa," Tommy said, settling down beside me with a glass of lemonade. "Mom says Uncle Rick isn't ever coming back." "That's right, buddy, he's not." "Good." He made Mom sad, and he made the house feel scary. Out of the mouths of babes. Tommy had understood the fundamental truth about Rick that took the adults much longer to articulate. He'd brought darkness into their lives, and his absence had restored the light. "Tommy, do you still have those letters you wrote?" He nodded solemnly. "Mom and I read them together sometimes. She says I was very brave to write them, even if I was too scared to send them." "You were brave. And you know what? Those letters helped save your mom. They helped me understand what was happening and how to fix it." Tommy beamed at this. "Really? Really? Really?" Sometimes when adults are scared, they need kids to be brave first and show them the way. As the afternoon faded into evening, Chloe arrived to pick up Tommy. She looked relaxed, healthy, genuinely happy for the first time in months. "How was your day?" she asked Tommy, ruffling his hair. "Great. Grandpa and I harvested tomatoes and he told me about the time he had to catch a chicken in the army." Chloe laughed, a sound that had become music to my ears after months of fearful whispers. "Did he tell you about the time the chicken won?" As they prepared to leave, Chloe hugged me tightly. "Dad, I don't know how to thank you for what you did. You don't need to thank me. You just need to keep living your life freely and raising that amazing boy. I never thought I'd feel safe again," she said quietly. Rick made me believe that danger was everywhere, that anyone who offered to help had ulterior motives, that I couldn't trust my own judgment about people. That's what predators do. They make you afraid of everyone except them, so you become completely dependent on their protection. But you showed me that real protection doesn't come with strings attached. Real help doesn't require you to give up your dignity or your autonomy. As I watched them drive away, Tommy waving enthusiastically from the passenger seat, I reflected on the lessons this experience had taught us all. Evil often comes disguised as help. The people who want to control us will convince us they're the only ones who can protect us. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is trust the people who love us enough to fight for our freedom, even when we're too scared to fight for it ourselves. Rick had tried to isolate my family to make them believe they were alone and helpless. But family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who will stand beside you when the world feels dangerous, who will fight for you when you can't fight for yourself, and who will help you rebuild when the threat has passed. Tommy's letters, hidden under his bed for months, had become the key to our liberation. In trying to find help for his mother, he'd created the evidence we needed to expose Rick's lies and manipulation. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages. And sometimes the weight of fear can only be lifted by the strength of love and the courage to act when action seems impossible. My family was safe. My grandson was thriving. My daughter was free. And in my backyard, the tomatoes we'd planted together were growing strong and sweet under the summer sun.